Earlier also, I spoke to a very special guest. Michael Kugelman is one of the leading South Asia analysts based in the United States. Michael, one of the vexed issues thrown up by this India-Pakistan conflict continues to be the role of America and the Trump administration. Trump even going to the extent of suggesting it was pressure by the United States, including the carrot of trade talks, that was responsible for stopping the fighting. How should we read Donald Trump's role in this entire conflict and that of the U.S. administration, Michael Kugelman?
Well, I think that President Trump is someone who likes to place himself at the center of events like this. He likes to be projected as someone who can broker peace in a very prominent way. And that might, I think, overstate what actually happened in terms of the nature of the U.S. involvement. It's very clear that U.S. officials did intervene diplomatically to push the two sides to de-escalate and indeed push for a ceasefire. But I think that one might argue that the way in which the president described the U.S. role might overstate the role and the actions of the Indians and the Pakistanis themselves.
Is it, though, Michael, just Donald Trump being true to form and, as you said, keeping himself at the center of issues? Or is there even a grain of truth when he starts speaking about offering to mediate, settle the Kashmir issue? Is this a president who likes to play to the gallery and put himself above the din of the rest?
No, I mean, I think that we need to acknowledge that there was a significant level of U.S. involvement. And, there's been so much focus on how the U.S. had signaled early on in the crisis that it would be aloof and that it would play a hands-off role. The fact that, J.D. Vance had said that, the U.S. won't get involved in other people's wars. But the message from U.S. officials throughout the crisis was de-escalation, pushing for de-escalation. And Marco Rubio was very engaged on very high levels. He was in touch with his counterparts in India and Pakistan several times over the course of the crisis. And my understanding is that Rubio himself, along with J.D. Vance, had a number of conversations with counterparts in India and Pakistan, and were in a position to encourage the two sides to to look toward a ceasefire. But I would also make this point. By the time the crisis had reached the point it did, when you had both countries launching drones and missiles onto each other's territory and hitting military targets, by that point, I would argue that both India and Pakistan actually had arrived at a point where they could claim victory and essentially call it a day, because they could tell their publics that, look, we had inflicted significant damage on each side. We had sent strong messages to the other side. And in that sense, when U.S. officials began getting involved in pushing for the ceasefire, one could argue that they were pushing at an open door, in the sense that maybe there was already a willingness on the part of the Indians and Pakistanis to talk amongst themselves toward a ceasefire.
But let's look at the steps ahead now, Michael. During his statements, Mr. Rubio has said this is not only a ceasefire, but India and Pakistan have agreed to talk on a broad set of issues. Now, remember, a dialogue between the two countries has been frozen in recent years. Do you believe that the Americans can actually will push for a dialogue at some neutral place? Because India has made it very clear, we will only talk on terror and on Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. That's what Prime Minister Modi very clearly said in his speech.
I mean, my sense is that the Americans concluded that they might have to include language like that in order to get the Pakistanis to agree to a ceasefire, because clearly that's something that the Pakistanis would be much more inclined to do than the Indians. I mean, as you indicate, there wouldn't appear to be any desire on the part of India to hold talks with Pakistan, and that was reiterated, I think, in the Prime Minister Modi's speech. And so I would not place too much stock in that. And indeed, I mean, it was only the Americans that put that out there. It was only Rubio in his tweet where he talked about that possibility. I don't really think that we should take that very seriously.
There's one other concern, Michael Kugelman, but that by their statements, the nature of Trump's statements, the United States is actually re-hyphenating India with Pakistan. Now, do you really believe that Washington is going to equate India and Pakistan? Surely India is on a different plane. How can one equate the perpetrator of terror, i.e. Pakistan, with India, which has suffered as a result of Pakistan-sponsored terror?
Right, exactly. I mean, we've seen in recent years that the policy of the U.S. is not to hyphenate. There's been a significant level of de-hyphenization, particularly as the U.S.-India partnership has really taken off in a big way. And in that sense, again, I wouldn't place too much stock in these some of these comments that we've heard recently from President Trump, and that includes his comment that he'd like to seek a solution for Kashmir. I do not think that reflected policy. I think it was just a case of him understanding that this is a difficult challenge, and that maybe he should be the one that tries to make an attempt at trying to encourage the sides to push forward on resolving it, not maybe understanding the context, the very complex context, as well as the geopolitical aspects of this. So I don't think that we should take President Trump's comment that very seriously at all, and clearly nothing is going to come of it.
Let me turn to something, though, Michael, that perhaps we should all take seriously. Given what you've seen that's happened in the last couple of weeks between India and Pakistan, and India has been very careful, not even calling it a ceasefire, but an understanding with Pakistan, have the events of the last few weeks only shown what a dangerous place the subcontinent can be? And do you really believe that the danger clouds have passed us by, or could we be heading for more difficult times, given that India has implicitly said now that every act of terror will be treated effectively as an act of war?
I think that there's the trajectory here for India-Pakistan relations is not a very positive one, which is a bit ironic in that really for the last 4+ years, India-Pakistan relations had been relatively stable following the LOC truce in early 2021. But the fact that we now see that both countries are very willing and comfortable to use significant levels of limited force under the nuclear umbrella, I think that's concerning. That suggests the possibilities of escalation are high. And also the ceasefire it will be fragile. I mean, ceasefires by definition are meant to be temporary, but given the comments we heard from Prime Minister Modi in his speech yesterday, really an emphasis on how this is all very temporary, and it's just a matter of time before things could pick up again. And on the Pakistani side, that clearly will be seen as a provocation. The very fact that Prime Minister Modi essentially said that this is a temporary thing, and it could pick up again. So, and I would also add that the weaponry that was used in this most recent crisis was very advanced. You had drones being used, and it appears that both sides have now been able to diversify their sources of arms suppliers so that you have both countries in a position to fill the gaps in their indigenous defense production to get really high-powered weaponry that can really move the needle forward in terms of strengthening their own capabilities. The Pakistanis were using Chinese-made weaponry, and it appears Turkish weaponry as well.
One final question, Michael. Given, as you say, that we could be heading for unstable times, do you see the United States playing a greater role, given the fact that in general the Trump administration has largely taken a more inward-looking policy? Do you believe that if the situation remains fraught, does Washington actually want to play a greater role in the subcontinent at all?
Well, I mean, as you know, I mean, the historical pattern for U.S. policy is that it really stays away, so to speak, from the India-Pakistan relationship. I mean, it has a strong interest in the relationship being workable, but generally speaking, it's not trying to involve itself in the relationship unless and until you have an actual crisis. And I suspect that will continue, though I do think that the last few days will be a lesson to officials in Washington that even though the strategic focus of the Trump administration in its first few months in power has been in other areas, right? Whether you're talking about Gaza or Ukraine or areas closer to the U.S. or China, that it's important to keep an eye on what's happening on the subcontinent. So that's not to suggest that you're going to see more active involvement, active mediation by the U.S., but I do think that there will be more of a strategic focus on the region than there might have otherwise been had this crisis not exploded.
Michael Kugelman, for setting us in context where you believe the Trump administration stands on the Indo-Pak conflict. I appreciate you joining me there from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much.